wondering how to pronounce his name, he told me the little key secret. The secret is forget there is a single G in his last name. Ululu. Did I say that right? No. See, I need to stay in Turkey longer. Okay, I'm Ayla McCoy, and I'm the wine columnist for Bloomberg News. In case you don't know a lot about Bloomberg News, it's an example, certainly, of a media company that grew through digital communication. It started in 1990, and today it has 146 bureaus around the world, more than the New York Times. It has several thousand reporters, and it has 78 million page views per month. And so it's really in a product of the digital age, shall we say. And it has 8 localized versions in different languages, and produces 6,000 stories every single day, many of which are about an obscure stock. As you know, it started as a financial news organization, so many of those stories about an obscure stock that only about 3 people in the world care about, but they care about it a lot. So here we are in Turkey. So I've only been here a few days, and already I'm ready to move. So I think it's a great place. I traveled down to the Gallipoli Peninsula to look at wineries, and I was really stunned by how beautiful everything is. So our topic today is this kind of big question for 50 minutes, which is of relevance, I think, to just about every single winery or region that is trying to move into the larger global wine context. So the question we're all trying to answer up here is, what's the potential of digital communications as a way for the wine industry to approach the trade and consumers in Turkey and abroad? And especially in Turkey, because of some significant obstacles to expansion. So we have this very knowledgeable panel up here. Next to me, I have to get my pronunciation guide going, is Gazden Gurbazitic. Okay. And she is someone who is very involved in this. She's going to share some facts and figures with us. She has had a lot of marketing experience at multinational companies, and she is now very involved with and played a key role in establishing the Cairo brand that's owned by Diageo. And so she essentially is managing a lot of the wine business unit of Cairo. Next to her, we have anne-victoriemonrozier, aka Miss Vicky Wine. And she's going to talk about, she's the daughter of a winemaker in Beaujolais, and she is, as she said to me, she has been created, essentially, in her brand through social media. So she's going to talk about a specific example of how one person has been able to expand her brand and create a brand and wines and using social media. Then we also have next to her Margaret Tiegelman, who is from the Netherlands. It's a very international group up here. The owner of Vinium Wines in the Netherlands, and it's a full-service marketing agency. He's worked with groups like the Wines of Moldova. He's worked with, more recently also, with Wines of Bolivia. So he has a lot of experience in how you make people even aware there are wines in Moldova. So, And then next to Marco, we have Ume Chavekar. Ume, by the way, means delicious in Japanese. That's what Ume told me, so I'm sure it's true.
What I learned from yesterday.
What?
I learned that yesterday.
You learned it yesterday. So he's coming at the topic from a different direction. He's an architect, a wine consumer, and a wine expert here in Turkey, who's been a consultant on the Turkey part of the next edition of the World Atlas of Wine. And so he'll talk a little bit about what do Turkish consumers expect and want, and something about why there are these obstacles in Turkey. So those are the people that are going to talk. I just want to say a couple of things first, and that is how many people in this audience are actually winemakers or work at a winery or anybody? Okay, so a few people. All right, so if you people have any specific questions, we'll have time for that. And I forgot to mention, of course, Connor at the end, at the other end over there. I expect everybody knows him by now. If you don't, please introduce yourself. So it's been said by a lot of people, especially American bloggers, and that the wine industry is one of the slowest to adopt internet-based technologies. But at the same time, consumers are living, they're learning, connecting, and buying online. And when you consider that, just take the US, which is the market I know the best, that 125,000 labels are approved by the TTB, our official organization that has to approve all labels of wine sold in the US. 125,000 labels, if you want your label to stand out, you're going to have to do something more than make a few phone calls. So, a few thoughts. There are three parts to this topic. One is about how do you reach consumers around the world. Another is how you reach consumers in Turkey. A third is how do you reach wine importers and retailers around the world, the trade, in other words, B2B. So those three, and of course the media is thrown in there somewhere. The second part of all of this is what do we actually mean by digital communications? What's included in that? What's important? Having a website is pretty basic these days, but what needs to be on it? And one thing I would say about Turkey is that I've gone to a few websites of wineries and they are in Turkish. And if you want to be in the US market, that's not going to be too helpful, since I don't know very many people that they would go and think, where's the little flag that says, English? So we're going to talk about what kinds of outreach are the most important and the most successful, because you can't do everything at once. Okay, so first we're going to start with Gaston, and you have worked in other industries. Tell us about whether you think wineries and the wine industry in Turkey lag behind in other industries, and how some facts and figures about who's using the internet in Turkey and what Kera has been doing to reach those people.
Okay, these are all three big questions.
Big questions,
I can
right.
talk like for hours, but very briefly, I don't know whether anyone has made an outline about Turkish market. The population is around 74 million. About 60% of it is below 34 years of age, so it's a very young population. The alcoholic beverage usage is very low. It's around less than 30%, so a bit above 18 years old population due to religious or other reasons. And when you look at wine industry, let's say preference, it's coming from after beer or rakı or vodka. So it's number 4 category. And at the moment it's getting competition with whiskey as well, because whiskey is also dominating in the market. And it's quite a small category, and when you look at the other categories, they are very, very monopolistic structure. There are like in beer or in rakı, the population is very integrated with the brands, and there are only 1 or 2 brands. And so I mean, and when they make a communication, they make a communication not to the in terms of a brand, in terms of a category. And when you come to wine, which is a relatively smaller category in Turkey, it's a very fragmented market. There are lots of domestic producers, and the producers like us, we are trying to not to talk to consumers, but we do make lots of trade investments relative to when we look at our total marketing investments. I just wanted to draw a little bit of the framework here. And this also affects what we are doing in terms of communication. We are one of the leading communication investing companies within wine industry, and what we are trying to do is trying to make an integration within our plans towards consumers, and we are one of the very early adopters of digital media. And we see the potential there, but when you compare to wine consumers versus the digital media users in Turkey, there are, let's say, 36 million people who are on the internet among the 74 million, so it's almost 50-50.
So it's almost 50%.
Yeah, and it's going to be more than 50 million expected within 2 years. So it's a big nation, and it's number 4 in Facebook, number 11 in Twitter. So everybody is online, especially the youngsters, and it's very high ratio because of the consumers and the population profile in terms of adoption. But when you cross it with wine consumers and wine, let's say, who are looking for wine information, or let's say when we are trying to catch the consumers in wine, it's not very crossing by very well. But all these consumers, in a way, is going to grow up, and they will somehow will become because the wine population consumption group is about 30-35 years old in Turkey, and the main core group. And it's more urban, and it's more educated, and it's more women than any other category in Turkey. So we are trying to catch that population, and what we are trying to do with Kyra, we are trying to make different communication at different target segments. So we have different brands, and we use different brands underneath of Kyra to communicate our different strategies. And they are always connected online and offline, because experiential situation is important. And when we try to create a trial effect, and it has to be an offline environment. But when we try to increase the impact of it, it becomes more integrated, and people are getting more engaged. When I compare it with other industries, on the other hand, there is a big effect of television consumption, obviously. The frequency of people consuming, let's say, television as media is 77%, whereas internet is 29%. So people are watching television a long time, long hours. And the other industries are using their digital communication integration always with television campaigns. And the impact of it, of course, gets bigger and larger. And there are quite big investments coming up. And I think, for example, the telecommunication industry, the banking industry, the automotive industry, and some of the FMCG companies are making lots of investments in both integration terms. I can go on like this.
Well, you know what? I think one question would be, you know, are you permitted in Turkey to advertise wine through the internet?
Okay, all right. That framework again. Alcoholic beverages are banned on television, radio, very limited on outdoor, where there are some municipalities which are liberal, let's say. Sponsorship or events, it has to be plus 24 years old. You cannot make any promotion that will have an effect to sell wine, let's say coupons or you know, this kind of. You can do discounts, but you cannot announce the discounts. You are not allowed, permitted to do that. So, and very limited selling points. Let's say exposure. 2 years ago, we used to do, let's say, cross-marketing events with, let's say, pasta or cheese with wine, these kind of things, and now it's not permitted within the stores or anything. And it's a very limited. And 2 years ago, we were permitted to do direct marketing through internet. Now it's banned. So that's also something that's really difficult for us. So when you do communication through internet, you just cannot see the result if you are not kind of selling it in that kind of return on investment wise. So here's the situation.
So in other words, websites are permitted, but you can't sort of quote advertise.
Yeah, actually, it's a very liberal environment for us because we can show our viral, let's say, television. If we make a television kind of a commercial, we can show it through YouTube or viral, which we had an example, for example, in another category, and the viral got so popular that they used that viral in an offline campaign as well afterwards. This kind of things happens, and it's a pretty liberal environment for us to use lots of tools.
So that gives you a little bit of a picture, and I'll just mention that in terms of the production of wine here in Turkey, the figures that I got from Gautam are 57,128,955 liters in 2011. That's a lot of wine. And only 2.5 million liters of that is exported at present. So I'd like to turn to Umay and have him say, well, why is this conflict essentially come about, and who are the consumers that are drinking here in Turkey? And just to give us a feeling of the country we're actually in and how people who live here are drinking wine, and what the limitations are. We've already heard some on the growth of this country. Okay, Umay.
Before talking about what to do actually with the use of social media, I want to comment on how we ended up where we are today with a very brief historical background of the relationship of the Turks with the consumption of alcohol. Most of you are here maybe for the first time, and you have already tasted your narinces, your kuzguzes, and have a basic idea about the wine scene in Turkey. And go and ask anyone on the street, and they will say that Turkey is actually one of the birthplaces of wine. And there's truth in this, as stated yesterday by Doctors Williamos and McGovern. The ancient civilizations that inhabited where modern Turkey sits today, from the Hittites to Assyrians to Urartians, Phrygians, Thracians, and the Lydians, had always been involved in making wine and growing grapes, with all the relevant customs, all religious attributes, all the festivities and ceremonies, all building up through the Roman and Byzantine times. Then Turks have settled in Anatolia late in the 11th century, and they had been always busy broadening their frontiers and establishing institutions. they were fresh converts to Islam, and the consumption of alcohol was prohibited, which contradicted mainly with their old customs of drinking, which brought forth, in my opinion, the 1,000-year-long conflict and encounter of Turks with the consumption of alcohol. They let the non-Muslim communities produce it and sell it, and actually tolerated its consumption by all, mainly for economic reasons, but prohibited it time and again. This dilemma has obviously continued throughout the short history of the modern republic, with burdensome regulations and the current taxation system. Thus, resulting from 1,000 years of neglect, there is still an absence of administration, absence of guiding rules in the wine industry today. And this is actually a brief historical account of the first 1,000 years. What we are talking about, the modern Turkey, which is roughly the last century, early from the 1920s up to where we are today, I group it, again in my opinion, into three basic stages. In stage one, from 1920s comes the forced exchange of population between the Greek settlers and the Turks. And this led mostly to the closure of the wineries that are run by the Greeks, by the Armenians. Some of them were handed over to Turkish companies, neighboring Turks, and these were the early producers, some of which are still operating today. There were attempts by the founder of the Republic, Kemal Atatürk, who established Atatürk Orman Çiftliği, a winery in Ankara, mainly for the production of wine, developing winemaking techniques, and basically evaluation of the surrounding vineyards in Ankara, in central Anatolia. Then it was Doluca in southern Thrace and Kavaklıdere in central Anatolia that were the earliest pioneers in wineries, later joined by many small and mid-scale producers, and due to the competitive threats by the then potent Tekel, which is the state monopoly, both companies and the overall industry focused on marketing and sales rather than quality and diversity, which I think is basically the first phase of Turkish wine, which lasted almost 75 years. Then came the early boutique wineries at the end of the 1990s, actually 1992, when Sarafin, again in the Thrace, and Gülor, also in the Thrace, that established chateau-style wineries with surrounding vineyards, and all planted with international varieties. That was the period when import of wine was banned, was prohibited, and this was very welcome because these wineries produced wine and labeled them as monovarietals, which was new for Turkey, and this was very cheerful and applauded, which I believe ignited the second phase, and most of the existing wineries then started initiating their own plantations with international grapes mostly, and building wineries where they have their own vineyards. And most important of all, this forced the industry to focus on a quality-oriented approach rather than the sales-directed perception before. Almost half of the current notable producers in Turkey today were formed in the early 2000s under the guidance of this new era, and then import of wine was allowed only in the 2000s, although with protective tax policies, and the consumers had suddenly much more alternatives, which helped also to the increase of the quality. This time, from the second phase to the third phase, the quality was the means of motivation, and wineries started recruiting foreign consultants to improve their viticultural and winemaking practices. also searched new markets abroad for the hope to export their wine. They asked international authorities to assess their wine through competitions and tasting events, which made another truth down on the whole industry, and which was that they had to focus on their own grapes instead of the international varieties that the world of wine was almost fed up. So they had to divert to their own techniques, own customs, and most important of all, their own grape varieties, which was neglected actually in the first and the second phases. I don't want to turn you off with many numbers and statistics, but I want to just comment with a bit of numbers at where we are. Currently we have just over 140 producers in Turkey, 50 of which are well known to the conscious consumer, and this number is increasing in a rattling rate. Each vintage we welcome a new enthusiastic producer who's making a difference, trying to make a difference somehow. But still, the total production is just over 500,000 hectoliters in 2012. We are the 6th largest producer of grapes, 5th largest in vineyard area. But for an analogy, the 6th largest producer, China, is producing 11 million hectoliters. So we are not using most of the grapes for wine. Also, by the number of wine producers, for example, in Luxembourg, which is, you know, a relatively small country, there are 55 producers, almost are the same number as our well-known producers. I just mentioned all about these because we have really room for growth, and we are still a very small producer of wine, and there is still too much room for development.
Okay, I think we'll just sort of move on, and we'll come back to some more things afterwards. But we want to move on to Morocco right now, and I want to, Morocco, who has developed all these campaigns for a number of places like Wines of Moldova, as I mentioned before. I'd like you to talk a little bit about what is it that you have to start with when you're thinking about when you're thinking about how to use digital communication for an industry that's growing, and you can hear how new it is. The fact that in the 2000s, this is when a lot of these wineries in Turkey were established. You know, how do you go about? What are the important tools for each of these groups of people? Business to consumers outside in an export way. Marco.
Yes, some very interesting numbers from you, Umay. I think Wines of Turkey is at the, I would say, starting point of becoming a wine-producing nation. There's many grapes in the ground, I've heard. Not many grapes are used for wine yet, so there might be a good potential for Turkey to start truly exporting and becoming a country that is known for its wine. In my opinion, you need to sell a country first before you can sell any kind of wine. So for the modern day consumer, whether they are going to the supermarket, whether they're buying the wine online, whether they are surfing the internet looking for wine information, the market is certainly very crowded. There are very many wine-producing countries that have a lot of money to spend. They have a lot of markets conquered already. So Wines of Turkey is really at the grassroots of starting. So how do you go about it? Well, I have a very simple answer, of course. The first one is get through to the stakeholders of the industry, the real people that you need to sell your wine to. And in some cases, this might be direct consumers. in which case we're talking to business to consumers or B2C. But in most cases, they are actually businesses, importers, distributors, B2B. And to reach these importers, there is one simple question you have to answer. And this is an exact comment I got from the largest importer in Holland. They were faced with wines from Macedonia. And Macedonian wine is also relatively new in the era and not really well known. The question was from this importer, what are you doing to help me sell this wine? In other words, what is the story that you can tell in order to sell that particular wine? Why would any consumer pick up a wine from Turkey? Okay, some might pick it up because it's intriguing, never heard of it, but most of them would probably not even notice because they're not looking for wines of Turkey. So in other cases, you need to help sell the wine to the importer. And this then develops a story. I think that's where we need to start. Develop a storyline that will help sell the country and help sell the wines of Turkey. This could be done through a simple platform. Maybe we use a very efficient internet nowadays, where we develop a website or a platform where people go and learn about Turkish wine. That's more or less created, I believe, with the Wines of Turkey platform. But I don't think that's enough. It needs to be a really compelling and interesting story that will grab the interest of the consumer. It needs to be intriguing. It needs to be, I want to know more about Turkish wine. Because you've got a great country, I think you have the benefit of a mass tourism here. And I think that can be explored, that can be used. I think most consumers who come here to Turkey are probably not necessarily directly interested in wine. So we need to tell that story and make a compelling story altogether. And that's something that's done with all the wineries. I heard from Umay, you have at the moment about 140 producers. So to work together with all those producers is an absolute critical item in promoting Wines of Turkey. There is no single winery, large or small, that can grab the imagination of the consumer today. I think that is the story here to tell. You need to sell the country Turkey, and all the wineries together need to sell then the wines of Turkey. And that's the way forward in stepping stones to create a platform to do that, to deliver that probably through a unique internet site that can be linked with Twitters, with hashtags, etc. If all the wineries are doing that, I think that's a great way to start.
Okay, thanks Marco. And I think we want to move along a little quickly so that we can also save time for some of your questions. So, Ms. Vicky, tell us, I have here, I was born on social media and would be nothing without it. So, tell us how social media helped you become Miss Vicky and Miss Vicky Wine.
Yes, I was born in 2009. I was born, it took me a while to be born. Now, I was in a PR agency specialized in social media in France, and they told me, to show the example to your clients, to our clients, because I was just an intern, you need to have a blog, and so why don't you open a blog? I said, yeah, okay. So what do I want to write about? And my dad is a winemaker. I wasn't studying anything about wine, and I only drank Beaujolais in my life. And I was dreaming of marrying an American boy in California and marry a winemaker maybe and work in Napa Valley. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write about wine in English, so maybe some American is going to read me and fall in love with me. So actually it didn't work, but I created the blog Miss Vicky Wine, and the name was, people liked the name. And I liked to write about wine, and I discovered I liked more than Beaujolais. I liked wine, and I liked to travel and visit wineries and And it was good to be able to say thank you by writing an article about the winemaker after a very enjoyable visit. And anyway, it started like that, but then I came to EWBC. Why? Because I really wanted to go to the US, so I contacted all the bloggers in the US. So, you know, I think, so that's my story, but to be more broad, I think now, consumer, like in France, internet is a source of information to get information about the wine. So before you have the guides, you have your friends and everything. So, and your friends are on social media. So anyway, internet is very, very important. And as a blogger or as a brand owner, I think the connection in between the trade, the journalist and the consumer is there. There is something happening. And it's what makes the real world and then the online world work together and create synergies. I don't know if you see what I mean. Anyway, I contacted all of the bloggers in the US, and a few answered and were interested in meeting me. And then I met Luis Alberto, that is a wine lover, and he told me, oh yes, and yeah, you can come work with me in New Jersey. Why don't we meet in Lisbon at this conference for wine bloggers, and we'll talk about it. So I came to Lisbon, and he said, yeah, okay, I want to buy your wine, and I agree on creating the Miss Vicky Wine brand. That's all through social media. So my story about connecting and creating the brand from meeting people online and then seeing them in real life is the one that could happen to any winemaker that comes today to Turkey and talks about his wine and then tweets about his wine and meets people through hashtags and then becomes a winemaker that has a little life and that is getting someone slowly online and build his audience and his consumer and then reaches his consumer and get the buyers connecting through the internet and everything. So now, I was born in 2009, so in Lisbon at the EWBC, I mean my wine, because it took maybe 6 months for my blog to become a wine. And now, I'm not rich, but I have more than my wine. I have 5 wines. Well, I have my family wines, and I created a brand through social media by selecting winemakers online or by connecting with other my brand ambassadors and gathering them to choose my wines. And now I have buyers connecting on Facebook to buy my wine or to get the information, the price. I have people that like my wine that post pictures online. I have journalists that write articles about me because they see me online. And I mean, it's everything folding all together right now. So I don't know if
I think one of the things that I find particularly interesting is the idea of reaching out to a community and having people from the social media community work with you on the particular wines that you're going to put out for that. That's very unique and interesting kind of.
Yes, but so my story is my story, and I don't think it's anyone that can do exactly what I did. What I want to say is that you have to believe in it, you have to understand it's going to take time, you have to be consistent, and you have to create your identity, one that you feel at ease with, and one that has an echo in your audience. And I really, really used the feedbacks of my close ambassadors or of people I didn't know that reacted through social media about, like, you know, it's very emotional, it's wine, it's passion, it's pleasure, it's everything. And people talk, and then you need to listen. And if you listen and you sit back and think, okay, they say that, I think that, maybe we can, where should I go? So I have this duck, you see, this is my identity. It started with a duck, a pink duck. That's really not something crazy, but everyone loves him more than I do because I'm getting tired of it. And I wanted to get rid of the duck because it was too much everywhere in the pictures, and people complained. People were like, but where is the duck? We missed the duck. We want to see the duck. And so because I really didn't want the duck too much anymore, I've put it lighter on my bottles. So it's on each of my bottles, you find the duck that created me, well, was next to me all the time at first, you know, and like my little friend, and he's still on every bottle. And that's how to be consistent and keep what people like, but also do what you think is good for yourself. So.
That's great. You know, before we have questions, I just want to ask Tanner briefly if he could tell us, you know, Wines of Turkey obviously is an organization like Marco was speaking about, that you have to have a group. You have to, one brand is not going to be able to just suddenly go on Facebook and start tweeting and everyone is going to flock to buy that wine. So, Tanner, could you just tell us briefly, how old is Wines of Turkey and what sort of digital communicating you're doing at present, other than having a fantastic bloggers conference?
Thank you, Ella. Wines of Turkey is very young, younger than Wiki. We started, actually established Wines of Turkey at 2008. But with regards to social media, I can say that Wines of Turkey was established in 2011 in the conference which we organized in London from Vitis to Vinifera. It was the first instance that we started to use the social media. And it was, of course, in international arena platform, I shall say. We didn't use it in the local Turkey-wise. This EWBC is the first time, I shall say, that we are using the social media within Turkey. So in that term, we are just newborn in social media. And it's interesting that we are quite new in this regards, and EWBC is a huge event with regards to social media. It's like, you know, think about a father trying to teach his son to swim. There are many ways, but one way is to, you know, pick your son and throw him to the sea. I think Turkey now is a situation regarding social media like this. You know, we don't know how to swim, but we started to learn to swim by EWBC, you know. But sometimes these are necessary for the industry. If you wait, if you wait the industry to decide about something, and if you wait the wineries, individuals about take time and decide how to do this more correctly, more politically, it may take tens of years. And Turkey doesn't deserve to be in this situation, because we are talking about a history going back to 9000 BC, which is 11,000 years ago from now. And not only Turkey, when you look at the geography, we are situated in East, whether you say it Eastern Mediterranean or Black Sea, Middle East, whatever, all these countries, I think, deserve a better place in wine industry. We have, you know, I have seen a picture in one of the Facebook pages. It was a world map, and it was showing the preferences of the people's alcoholic beverage preferences. And for example, they were signifying the places what people produce or drink. For example, Russia, it writes vodka. And in France, Italy, Spain, it says wine. And like Mexico, it says tequila. And in Australia, it says Foster's. And in the Middle East section, starting from Georgia, Anatolia, Turkey, and the Mesopotamia, it says boring. So I think, you know, from international arena and from the local point of view, we have many difficulties. Locally, we have bans, we have many obstacles, we have cultural limitations, and social media is, I think, like a medicine to this. We can reach the people, we can reach the opinion leaders, we can make them interactive, and we have to learn them quickly. And also not within the Turkey, from this grand terroir point of view, and from the Eastern Mediterranean, Black Sea countries in an international arena, I hope this conference will be a start from local point of view to take attention to social media within the wine industry, with the people, with the government, with, you know, with every related person, company, and from the international arena, all these grand terroir countries coming together and making a better image and to show our potential to the all to the world. Thank you.
Great. Well, we don't have a lot of time. I do have one last question for the panelists, but first I'd like to hear if there's anybody here who has a question that they'd like to put to all the panelists, to one of the panelists. Yes. Here, wait a minute. Let me just give you. Oh, there's one right there. Oh, no. Oh,
Thanks. Thanks, Ellen. Damien Wilson from the Burgundy School of Business. Look, just listening to the panel, there's something which sort of has come to me as being quite clear and obvious as something that can be communicated effectively on behalf of the Turkish wine sector. We heard from Tanner, you know, a very impassioned speech about the challenges and the image problem that's facing the wines of Turkey at the moment. And from Ume on the challenges with the infrastructure in place at the moment and some of the competitive nature of the bigger producers. But Marco, I think, hit on something which I thought was quite appropriate based on what the other two had mentioned. The image of communicating on behalf of wines of Turkey. What characteristics can they convey that people really appreciate? Now, just on my observations so far, in 2 days of being here in Turkey, I have never felt more welcomed and more pampered than any other experience I've been to in my life, than the hospitality afforded me as a guest to your country. And I think if you can't use that and communicate that as, you know, the sincere descriptions that Anne-Victoire were mentioning, you know, this is my life, this is my love. You know, I remember one of the earlier things I heard in marketing was sincerity. Once you can fake that, you've got it made. You don't need to do that. I mean, this is the whole thing. You're communicating that story. And I mean, I wanted to go back to what Gautam said. Gautam was saying about, you know, the challenges in communicating and how you've been forced to not communicate on mass promotion. I think that's fantastic because it compels producers to focus on the relationship between the producer and to do things such as relying on placement in I don't know, a local soap opera or something like that, I'm not sure. But you have to come up with innovative ways to communicate directly with your consumer in the usage occasion. And I think communicating that authentic message is something that you really can do and have the advantage over other markets. So, I mean, Ellen, your thoughts on that perhaps, or to the panel? What are your thoughts on being able to communicate that sort of message?
Yeah, well, if I might say something, I think wine and social media are actually a really good match. Because on one hand, we've got very individually handcrafted wines made by thousands and thousands of producers all over the world. And there we've got a mass medium which is not really useful in a sense like TV because it reaches out to so many people who don't actually care about wine. But there's social media where there is an opportunity for consumers who are interested in wine to learn a lot about it, to connect directly with consumers and the producers, to have a direct interface with each other. So I think there's a unique opportunity for the winemakers to reach out to that individual core consumer and speak to them and be relevant to them and have that community. That's where brand loyalty starts. And that's the only thing that's lacking in a supermarket when you look at wine consumption, it's brand loyalty. It doesn't exist really, because it's driven, as we all know, a lot by promotion, by a lot of mass communication, and that's what you can avoid if you are able to connect a winemaker, a big wine, a nice wine brand that's coming from a place, a specific place here in Turkey, connecting to a specific wine consumer in the US, wherever. He then connects to that particular place. So you've got a unique opportunity to capture that and to add that value and make that connection. Yeah, thanks.
I would also like to add something. I totally agree that we have to get together and do something together, because our inner voices, it's just like inner voices, like 140 small producers. When you compare it with the alcoholic beverage consumers, and they do have this bombardment, let's say, from other categories, which they have to switch, let's say. They drink beer, rakı, or vodka, and sometimes wine, because the occasion of wine is so limited in Turkey. So we have to get together and try to create a wine occasion consumptions, rather than they only think it's for my special day when they think about wine. It's so specific and very limited. So I think for us, not only for abroad to communicate about the wines of Turkey, but also to create our own markets and enlarge it, we have to come together and talk with one voice. And that
I want to add something as well. I totally agree with Marco and Gözlem. And the main character of Turkey now is that we are alone as producers and consumers. There are no sets of regulations, no appellation system, no sense of place, no sense of vintages, no context actually, and we need to build on that. One of my teachers in the School of Architecture made a final speech when we graduated, and he told us that, and believe me, there was no internet when he said that. Consider yourselves running around a track, and you'll be with many counterparts from abroad, and don't be fooled that you are running on the same lap. They are way in front of you, many laps in front of you. So first of all, we need to build our regulations, our context, our regulations, and producers and consumers are alone for that. There are no regulatory bodies, so we need to do that mainly by the use of social media. And before that, I think we need to create a story, a fantastic story. We need to have an iconic producer, and we need to work together on that, no matter where that producer comes from, or no matter whose story this is, because everybody will benefit from that. Look at what Chateau Musar does for Lebanon, or Movia does for Slovenia, or look at what Jonathan Wardeman did for Georgia with his winery Pheasant's Tears. So no matter who this is, we need an iconic wine, a star producer, something like that. And also, we need to understand that the use of social media is not just to boost sales, but for marketing or for branding, but it is also a means to listen, to follow others. I think we are...
We're running out of time, okay. So I'm sorry. We can continue this conversation. I would just like to wrap up now and say thank you very much. I'm sorry we didn't have more time to ask more questions, but we really had. It's like a huge. We better have another conference, don't you think? So I think that if you want to reach out to any of these people up here outside, ask them any questions. I know they would welcome that. And thank you for being such an attentive audience. And have a great rest of the day and learn a lot.